Good afternoon. Thanks everybody for being here. My name is Carson Holloway. I'm the chair of the Political Science Department here at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. I'm also the director of this lecture series, the Constitutional Studies Forum, and this is our first public event of this academic year. So let me introduce our speaker. Let me also say I'm grateful to the Jack Miller Center for providing the funding for these lectures. They generously have supported us. And grateful, of course, to the Political Science Department for its co-sponsorship of the event and the History Department as well. Let me introduce our speaker. Our topic today is the Constitution viewed from without, the security dilemma, and the Constitution of 1787. Our speaker is Professor Michael Kochin. Michael Kochin is a professor extraordinarius in the School of Political Science, Government, and International Relations at Tel Aviv University. He received his A.B. in mathematics at the age of 19 from Harvard, which shows that he was taking life rather more seriously than I was at that age, I think. It's safe to say. And also his M.A. and Ph.D. in political science from the University of Chicago. He has held visiting appointments at Yale, Princeton, Toronto, Claremont McKenna College, and the Catholic University of America. He has written widely on comparative analysis of institutions, political thought, politics and literature, and political rhetoric. Professor Kochin is the author of 3 books, Gender and Rhetoric in Plato's Political Thought, 5 chapters on rhetoric, character, action, things, nothing, and art in 2009, and most recently, and important for our purposes, with the historian Michael Taylor, An Independent Empire, Diplomacy and War in the Making of the United States in 2020. So that's the book upon which I think his remarks today are somewhat based. And if you will join me in welcoming our guest speaker, I'd be grateful.
Thank you, Professor Holloway. Now, I'm very grateful to Carson and the University of Nebraska-Omaha for inviting me. The great thing about being an imperial historian of the United States is that since you study the biggest and most important event of the modern world, everywhere you go, you see something new. Yesterday, 198 years ago, August 30th, 1804, Lewis and Clark held council with the Yankton Sioux at Camp Calumet Bluff, 170 miles up the Missouri from here, just about. There, Captain Meriwether Lewis proclaimed, as he did presumably all along the river, that a great council was lately held between this great chief of the 17 great nations of America and your old fathers, the French and Spaniards. In this council, it was agreed that all the white men on the waters of the Missouri and Mississippi should obey the commands of the great chief of America. These arrangements being made, your old fathers, the French and Spaniards, have gone beyond the Great Lake toward the rising sun, from whence they never intend returning to visit their former red children in this quarter. Nor will they or any other nation of white men ever again display their flag on the troubled waters, because the mouths are now in the possession of the great chief of the 17 great nations of America, who can command his war chiefs to suffer no vessels to pass, but such as sail under the protection of his flag and acknowledge his authority. Children, you will perceive from what has been said that the great chief of the 17 great nations of America has become your only father. He is the only friend to whom you can now look for protection, or from whom you can ask favor or receive good counsel. And he will take care that you shall have no just cause to regret the change. He will serve you and not deceive you. That's, for those of you who aren't familiar, that's the usual rhetoric of Anglophone white people talking to Indians up through probably the Civil War. Now, when in May 1787, the Constitutional Convention opened, and that was half a continent away from here in Philadelphia, the old father, Carlos Sebastián Rey de España, still claimed these territories of Louisiana for his own, having been ceded them by the French as the price of releasing them from the failed alliance against Britain in the 7 Years' War. Carlos III suffered no one to trade with his Indian children, but such as ventured under the protection of his flag and acknowledged his authority. Nor in 1787 was the Indians' French old father entirely out of the picture. Though the French had formally renounced their claim to Louisiana in 1762, from that date until the 1802 collapse of Talleyrand's dream of a revived French New World Empire, thanks to the successful slave revolt on Saint-Domingue, that's Haiti today, the French had never ceased to scheme and plot with the Indians and settlers for an eventual return. Right? And if you look carefully through Washington's correspondence with Lafayette and his management of Lafayette, he was very leery of keeping Lafayette out of direct contact with the Indians, because they knew that the Indians had done a lot better under the French and had a lot to regret in the displacement of the French from North America. But if we want to understand what empowered Lewis to speak with the Yankton Sioux as he did in 1804, why here is America, right? Why we're in America today when we stand here? The events of 1787-88 in the then United States, which means that Omaha and Council Bluff are not included, are as or even more important than the Louisiana Purchase negotiated in Paris and the marvelous adventure of Lewis and Clark. So turning away from the whole story of the rise of the United States from independence to great power, which I and Michael Taylor tell in our 2020 book, An Independent Empire, I'm going to focus for the remainder of my time today on the contribution to that rise of the constitutional reform movement of 1787 to 88. I will try to say something new about the unfolding logic of the reform process, which we today call the ratification of the Constitution, as if we Americans have had only one. Now, in 1787, the 13 free and independent states were united in the Union under the Articles of Confederation, the first Constitution of the United States. That union could be lawfully and constitutionally revised only by consent of all 13 of its members. The 1787 Constitution was ratified and implemented unconstitutionally at a breakneck pace to the accompaniment of a Federalist drumbeat. In the face of the foreign and security threats looming for the infant United States, Federalists claimed there was no time to lose. And you can see that the process was fast when you consider that the whole process of ratification, from formal proposal in September to actual enactment with New Hampshire's ratification, took 278 days. Okay, 278 days. Only 2 of the 27 amendments took less time to ratify. That's 12 and 26. And that's notwithstanding Publius's claim in Federalist 85, there can therefore be no comparison between the facility of effecting an amendment and that of establishing, in the first instance, a complete constitution. So Publius's claim here is just turned out not to be the case. So it's worth thinking about how did this ratification thing go so quickly. By 1786, there was general consensus among politically active Americans that the government of the United States, as constituted by the Articles of Confederation, was too weak to manage the foreign affairs of the Union successfully. But the most important of those challenges were not really addressed until Washington's second term, if then. So what made the whole thing, so that's another way to see that the timing is strange, right? There were all these complaints, and they look like pretty good complaints about the imbecility, the incapacity of the United States under the Articles. But a lot of them weren't dealt with for years after the new Constitution was inaugurated. So why did ratification happen so quickly? Why was there, say, no time for a new convention to address the objections and grievances that would eventually produce the Bill of Rights? On the foreign and security policy challenges that faced the Union, supporters and opponents of the 1787 Constitution were generally agreed. During the ratification debate, John Jay summarized most of the principal difficulties in his address to the people of the state of New York. I'm going to quote an extenso from Jay because I think he says it better than I can. I'm sure he does. By the Confederation as it now stands, the direction of general and national affairs is committed to a single body of men, viz. The Congress. They may make war, but are not empowered to raise men or money to carry it on. They may make peace, but without power to see the terms of it observed. They may form alliances, but without ability to comply with the stipulations on their part. They may enter into treaties of commerce, but without power to enforce them at home or abroad. They may borrow money, but without having the means of repayment. They may partly regulate commerce, but without authority to execute their ordinances. They may appoint ministers and other officers of trust, but without power to try or punish them for misdemeanors. They may resolve, but cannot execute either with dispatch or with secrecy. In short, they may consult and deliberate and recommend and make requisitions, and they who please may regard them. From this new and wonderful system of government, it has come to pass that almost every national object of every kind is at this day unprovided for, and that other nations taking the advantage of its imbecility are daily multiplying commercial restraints upon us. Our fur trade has gone to Canada, and British garrisons keep the keys of it. Our shipyards have almost ceased to disturb the repose of the neighborhood by the noise of the axe and hammer. And while foreign flags fly triumphantly above our highest houses, the American stars seldom do more than shed a few feeble rays about the humble masts of river sloops and coasting schooners. Those of you against the Jones Act might want to think about that one. The greater part of our hardy seamen are plowing the ocean in foreign pay, and not a few of our genius shipwrights are now building vessels on alien shores. Although our increasing agriculture and industry extend and multiply our productions, yet they constantly we permit all nations to fill our country with their merchandise, yet their best markets are shut against us. Is there an English, a French, or a Spanish island or port in the West Indies to which an American vessel could carry a cargo of flour for sale? Not one. The Algerians exclude us from the Mediterranean and adjacent countries, and we're neither able to purchase nor command the free use of those seas. The U.S. was unable to negotiate successfully with the piratical states of North Africa because it couldn't threaten them effectively, nor could it even manage to pay ransom or tribute. Jay omitted two issues vital to the United States as a whole, but less relevant to his New York readership. Bringing the Indians of the Old Northwest and Southwest under firm United States rule. That's because New York's Indians had been thoroughly subjugated in the course of the Revolutionary War, as we discuss in this book, and opening the Mississippi to American navigation. Even eventual opponents of the 1787 Constitution wanted a more aggressive policy toward those foreign and security challenges. Those for and against the proposed Constitution of 1787 largely agreed on the foreign and security challenges, largely agreed that the Union is by far the better way to meet those challenges, and largely agreed that the Constitution needed to be reformed in order to meet those challenges. Supporters and opponents of ratification of the 1787 Constitution agreed on the foreign security and security benefits of union. They disagreed about whether those benefits dwarfed the costs and benefits of particular ways of reforming the Union. The official letter of the Philadelphia Convention to Congress to recommend the Constitution writes of the greatest interest, the consolidation of union versus the points of inferior magnitude on which each state was, in convention, was, quote, less rigid. So the opponents agreed that the greatest interest was in keeping the Union, but they disagreed to some extent as to on the points, whether on the points of inferior magnitude and whether they were really of sufficiently inferior magnitude to ratify without change what was proposed in Philadelphia. There was one sine qua non, one thing without which nobody would agree to ratify the Constitution. That was a belief that one would be more secure in one's property after ratification. The necessity, as James Madison said in the Philadelphia Convention, of providing more effectually for the security of private rights and a steady dispensation of justice. Property and land was a security issue because Americans had to believe that the clashing territorial claims of states would be sorted out fairly so that their titles to lands would be upheld. This had been accomplished by the Confederation Congress for the West north of the Ohio, as Publius writes. It had not yet been accomplished, however, for Vermont, which was still claimed in its entirety by New York at the time of ratification. Property in slaves was a security issue because that peculiar species of property, as George Mason called it, was uniquely vulnerable in times of invasion, as enslaved persons would always side with the invaders, especially when those invaders promised freedom. To return, if all or almost all who participated in the debate over the ratification of the 1787 Constitution are agreed on the need to retain and strengthen the Union, why does Publius, for example, and other supporters of ratification spend so much time defending the Union and attacking his opponents as disunionists? So my contention is that the proponents of the 1787 Constitution, but especially Publius, the corporate author of the Federalist, anonymous author of the Federalist, actually, historians tell us that's J. Madison and Hamilton, and but here I'm going to call it Publius. They argue for using what's been named by the philosopher Nicholas Shackle the Mott and Bailey fallacy. So let's see. Here's the Mott and Bailey that you might remember from high school Norman history. To understand, this is a 21st century logical term, okay? So the name for this form of argumentation was invented by a guy named Shackle in the 21st century. But just like ad hominem argument, right? You think you know how to hunt mastodon, I know how to hunt mastodon. That goes back long before anybody thought of these terms. People were doing this stuff without the language that Shackle has given us. So a Mott and Bailey castle, this is a Mott and Bailey castle. The Normans built them to hold down their conquered territory of England. It's a wooden tower standing atop a man-made mound or motte. The motte, in turn, is located within a courtyard of Bailey, encircled by a timber palisade with a fortified gate. The Bailey, in Shackle's terminology, is the proposition that's hard to defend, but most important to the argument, right? The Lord has all his house and his property and stuff is out there in the fenced-off area. On top, he has a little fortress to protect his life and his children. You make a bold, Scott Alexander explains the term, so the Bailey is the proposition that's hard to defend, but most important. The motte is the proposition that's easy to defend, but is less important. Okay? Scott Alexander explains the Mott-and-Bailey doctrine is when you make a bold, controversial statement. Then when somebody challenges you, you claim you were just making an obvious, uncontroversial statement, so you're clearly right, and they are silly for challenging you. Then when that clash is over, you go back to making the bold, controversial statement. So this is a complex logical notion, and it's complex because, in part, it refers to a series of statements rather than a single argument. Okay? What Shackle's trying to get us to understand is how people actually argue, and they make various arguments, and they're often connected in this structure, which he calls Mott and Bailey. If somebody can come up with a decent Greek or Latin term, I'd appreciate it. In arguing for the 1787 Constitution, the Mott is the necessity of union. That's what everybody agrees on. That's easy to defend. The Bailey is the necessity to immediately ratify the 1787 Constitution. Disunion, Publius claims, would invigorate foreign rivalries for influence and strife in America. Each state would be led to favor different foreign powers by their commercial specializations. The resulting countries, says Publius, would be formidable only to each other. Given the consensus over the foreign and security challenges faced by the United States in the 1780s, the real issue disputed by advocates and opponents of the 1787 Constitution was how Americans could attain a strong, effective union that was not oppressive. You read the Federalist Papers and other sources of other writings and speeches of advocates for ratification, you get the impression the serious alternative to the Union, as planned in the 1787 Constitution, was multiple confederacies. Now, if you actually look through the debates in their entirety, both sides, one finds disunions. Generally, everybody attributes disunion sentiments to the other side. Occasionally, disunion was framed as inevitable or desirable only if the course pushed forward by rivals is adopted. What you want is so terrible that even disunion would be better, and disunion is terrible. So everybody really agrees, basically, pretty much everybody agrees that disunion is terrible. Disunion was also sometimes threatened as a temporary expedient until the rivals have learned the error of their ways. Madison sums up the significance of disunion talk in his account of the proceedings of the Confederation Congress, 21 February 1787. Whatever the views of leading men in the eastern states may be, it would seem that the great body of the people are equally indisposed either to dissolve or divide the Confederacy or submit to any anti-Republican innovation. Herbert Storing's verdict, an excessively generous verdict, is well known in attributing to the Anti-Federalists an intention to move towards separate confederacies. Such Federalists as Publius were doubtless more than a little disingenuous. In other words, they were lying, right? The Federalists lied when they said the Anti-Federalists were disunionists. But actually, they were doing something worse, okay, which I'm going to explain to you. Something far heavier than the political misdemeanor about lying about the intentions of your opponents. Publius himself admits the idea of arguing for the Union, on which essentially all Americans are agreed. But Publius argues for the Union, his mot, precisely to distract from his less persuasive claim, his Bailey. The Bailey, as I said, is the proposition that immediate ratification of the 1787 Constitution is necessary to save the Union. Publius proclaims in Federalist 1, nothing can be more evident to those who are able to take a large view of the subject than the alternative of an adoption of this new Constitution or a dismemberment of the Union. The readiness, so the anti-federalist candidates, the readiness the readiness of the people to adopt the new Constitution arises in great degree from the apprehension that no other mode can be adopted. What is required, claim the Federalists, was not just ratification of the 1787 Constitution without reservations, conditions, or prior amendments, but immediate ratification. Conditional amendments or a second general convention will be fatal. The delay only of such experiments is too serious to be hazard, claimed James Madison. Attack the 1787 Constitution, and especially the demand for immediate ratification, immediate and unamended ratification, which is the less defensible Bailey, and Publius robs heavy rocks from the mot, the necessity of continued union, on which all are agreed. So pressed, the opponent of the 1787 Constitution immediately retreats and reaffirms their commitment to the Union. Occasionally, the opponent of the 1787 Constitution makes a comeback. It's your scheme, O Federalist, the 1787 Constitution that will lead to dissolution because it's too big for its own weight, because the small states will leave rather than be coerced by the big states. Sometimes he adds that it is you, O Federalist, who will break the Union rather than see it continue after your scheme has been defeated. But more often, and having made the Anti-Federalist stammer out his love for the Union, the typical Federalist goes back to arguing for immediate ratification of the 1787 Constitution, which is the Bailey. That this is how the Federalists, especially Publius, argue was already noted by an opponent of ratification. Sentinel gives a detailed account of how Publius uses Bott and Bailey argumentation. Of course, he hadn't read Shackle, so he didn't use the term. Sentinel charges that Publius uses the irrelevant but rhetorically powerful hobgoblin of disunionism to distract from the weakness of his case for immediate adoption of the particular forms embodied in the 1787 Constitution, the subject Publius was professedly treating. Let us stipulate, as almost every influential opponent of the 1787 Constitution was willing to do, that the U.S. faced foreign and security problems that required constitutional reform to strengthen the Union. If there was no immediate threat to the Union, then one of the fundamental arguments of Publius for immediate ratification would be false. Yet there is an immediate threat to the Union, and as we shall see, Publius is both part of the problem and part of the solution. To repeat, well, pretty much nobody except Patrick Henry, the Maryland farmer, denied the need for constitutional reform to deal with foreign and security challenges. The disagreement between supporters and opponents of the Constitution was whether of the 1787 Constitution was whether the reforms it proposed were the right constitutional reforms to adopt, both in terms of meeting the foreign and security needs of the Union and in terms of preserving free government under the Union at both the state and federal levels. The supporters of the 1787 Constitution succeed because they successfully used Mott and Bailey argumentation as the ratification process unfolded. The Federalists made continued union, rather than the particulars of their scheme for a reformed union, the dispositive issue before the state ratifying conventions. Now, how do they do that? How do they do that? No. Publius' basic argument, right, is that the 1787 Constitution responds to the same external challenges the Articles of Confederation did. The difference is that the 1787 Constitution responds effectively. Reopening discussion will not lead Publius' claims to a better scheme for energetic government and may lead to no alternative scheme at all. The details do not matter so much as to be worth trying to alter via a new convention. Without a sufficiently energetic government, the Union will not survive. The question, therefore, whether this amount of power shall be granted or not resolves itself into another question, whether a government commensurate to the exigencies of the Union shall be established, or in other words, whether the Union itself shall be preserved. Now here's how it worked, how they got ratification through. As the Federalist Papers was being published, the energetic government under the 1787 Constitution was coming into being as the states successively ratified it. So let's, there we are. So I hope that's legible. That's the map from the book. It shows you the states in order of ratification. If more energetic government cannot come into being to the Union as whole, Publius writes, it were better separate confederacies. If it be true, as has been insinuated by some of the writers on the other side, that the difficulty arises from the nature of the thing, and the extent of the country will not permit us to form a government in which such ample powers can safely be reposed, it would prove that we ought to contract our views and resort to the expedient of separate confederacies, which will move within more practicable spheres. So if we can't get reform, better disunion. Who's saying that? Publius, the Federalists, who never cease to accuse their opponents of being disunionists. Now, the prospect of separate confederacies is faced squarely in Federalist 43, which, as some of you will appreciate, is the middle paper of the 85 Federalist Papers. What relation is to subsist, writes Publius, between the 9 or more states ratifying the Constitution and the remaining few who do not become parties to it? In general, it may be observed that although no political relation can subsist between the assenting and dissenting states, yet the moral relations will remain uncancelled. The claims of justice, both on one side and the other, will be enforced and must be fulfilled. The right of humanity must in all cases be duly and mutually respected, whilst considerations of a common interest, and above all, the remembrance of the endearing scenes which are past, and the anticipation of a speedy triumph over the obstacles to reunion, will, it is hoped, not urge in vain moderation on one side and prudence on the other. Yet those who have been reading Publius since the beginning, or who share the general consensus regarding the necessity and not just the utility of the Union, know that separate confederacies means eventual war. As Jay had written in his address to the people of the state of New York, a mere hint is sufficient on this topic. The crisis of the Union, asserted by Publius in Federalist I, was produced not by the foreign policy difficulties of the Union, great as they were, but by the process of constitutional reform itself. It was that process, and not proximately the weakness of the Articles, that called the Union into question. If a second convention prior to ratification would have taken another year, it's hard to believe that that would have fatally crippled the ability of the U.S. to deal with the challenges, as listed, say, by Jay in the address to the people of New York. After all, the new federal government did little that directly and successfully addressed those challenges before 1793. The urgency of the ratification debate came from somewhere else. To understand the urgency of the ratification debate, including its one classical product, the Federalist Papers, we have to see that debate unfold in time. The opponents of the 1787 Constitution wanted to debate whether the federal government had to have all the powers granted by the 1787 Constitution in order to achieve the foreign policy and security ends of constitutional reform. By their Mott and Bailey argumentation and by their orchestration of the ratification process, the 1787 Constitution's proponents succeeded in forcing a different question upon the ratification conventions, whether the delegates preferred the 1787 Constitution or disunion. If the so-called anti-federalists wanted, almost to a man, to continue the Union and even strengthen its federal government to meet the foreign and security policy challenges both sides agreed that it faces, Who was arguing against the Union? In New York, Publius, who claimed that an energetic federal union must be formed even if that requires, quote, the expedient of separate confederacies. The anti-federalist position recognizes the historian Linda Grant DePauw, grew weaker with each new state that ratified the Constitution. The anti-federalist position grew weaker because they supported the Union, contrary to the position attributed to them by Publius and other federalists. Like the Federalists, the anti-federalists supported the Union and even wished to reform it because of its foreign and security policy benefits. So once the Federalist project of a separate energetic confederacy became actual, the anti-federalists were compelled by their beliefs about the foreign and security policy challenges the states faced, beliefs they shared with the Federalists, to fall into line with the reform. So here you can see the order of the states, the order by which they join. It's important to note, first of all, the ratification proceeds from the middle. Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, they found out about the plan early, but Delaware and New Jersey are small states, exploited therefore and endangered from large states. And Pennsylvania has A, serious Indian problems, and B, military incapacity is not so, its military capacity is not wonderful with respect to its population, partly because religious diversity, too many Quakers. But they ratify first. Then Georgia. Georgia, on this map, is large. It was sparsely populated, and the people actually living in those claimed boundaries, a lot of them were persons held in slavery, and a lot of them were Indians, and not big fans of white settlement, to say the least. So the Georgians are afraid. They need powerful government. In fact, Georgia was the only state where the British succeeded in installing civil government during the Revolutionary War, because of the fear. If they couldn't get effective American protection, they needed protection from somebody. So comes the 1787 Constitution offering better protection. The Georgians signed on right away. Connecticut's small. Really the crucial state, I think, in terms of tipping the balance is Massachusetts. Okay? Massachusetts is the military powerhouse of the states. There are a lot of people in that small state. They have tremendous government capacity in Massachusetts, and for that matter still do. Realistically, if there's going to be a split up of the US, your safety depends on having Massachusetts on your side and not on the other side, right? If you don't believe me, go to Charleston, South Carolina, and see what happens when you have Massachusetts as your enemy. Not good, not good. So that gets the crucial ratification, I think, is Massachusetts. And in Massachusetts, ratification is secured. The advocates of the Constitution promise that once this thing goes into operation, they'll consider amendments along the lines of the Bill of Rights that we have. And that's what gets ratification through in Massachusetts. After that, once Massachusetts State Number 6 ratified on February 6th, 1788, it was exceedingly unlikely that 3 states would not come in. The 3 next states to ratify, Maryland, South Carolina, and New Hampshire, were weak if the Union was reconstituted without them. South Carolina was, thanks to slavery and the Spanish-backed Creek and Cherokees, the most threatened after her neighbor Georgia. Maryland needed the Union to protect her from Virginia. And New Hampshire needed safety from New York, Massachusetts, the British, and Lower Canada, and most acutely from Vermont, which, as you can see in this map, was not in the Union. The territories claimed by New York, but the effective government was that of Vermont, which is not part of the Union, and which was negotiating with the British at the time to return to the British crown. Strong, populous, well-governed, free of debt, because it had exited the Revolutionary War in 1780 early, when it became clear that without the consent of New York, the United States was not going to admit Vermont. They said, well, in that case, we're not going to fight for you, which they didn't spend anything more on the war. And a number of New Hampshire towns, because Vermont was in a good fiscal position, a number of New Hampshire towns were looking to leave New Hampshire and join Vermont. So New Hampshire was actually threatened in its territorial integrity by Vermont being out of the Union. They needed the Union to protect them from Vermont. Virginia had ratified almost simultaneously with New Hampshire, warned by Edmund Randolph that the accession of 8 states, including South Carolina, reduced our deliberations to the single question of union or no union, i.e. union with us or union without us. New York ratified on 26 July 1788, only after the Constitution was formally made valid by the ratification of New Hampshire on 21 June. The anti-federalist majority of the New York Ratifying Convention gave in when forced to confront the new situation of the state if placed out of the Union and the dreadful consequences that must ensue. although a majority of the members of which conceived several articles of the Constitution so exceptional but such confidence and an invincible reluctance to separate from our sister states could have prevailed upon a sufficient number to assent to it without stipulating for previous amendments. So that's a contemporary letter in the New York Advertiser. The Federalists prophesied disunion if ratification failed, but disunion actually happened because ratification succeeded. Washington was inaugurated in New York in April 1789 as the president of a separate confederacy of 11 states, excluding North Carolina and Rhode Island. Ratification in North Carolina, once her elder sister Virginia had ratified, was never really in doubt. Yet it shows the strength of Union sentiment that Rhode Island persisted, even after the 1787 Constitution was put into effect without her, in acting as if she were not out of the United States. In May 1789, Rhode Island elects delegates to the Continental Congress, which no longer exists, right, as instituted by the Articles. After the House and Senate under 1787 Constitution already convened, and after President Washington already been inaugurated. Only when the new Union under the 1787 Constitution made clear to Rhode Island that they were now to be embargoed as foreign, as no longer part of the separate confederation that was the United States under the 1787 Constitution, did Rhode Island finally ratify. So what happened basically is the other 12 states seceded from Rhode Island and left Rhode Island out. And that Rhode Island, when the United States, which the 12 of them had usurped the name, leaving Rhode Island out. Only when Rhode Island was threatened that, okay, you're a foreign country and you're going to be treated under our trade laws as a foreign country, did the Rhode Islanders give in. The necessity of union and reform of the union was, as anti-federalists such as Sentinel realized, not what the ratification debate should have been about. If we take our should not from the real world of political argumentation, but from narrow notions of ideal democratic debate. The Federalists used Mott and Bailey argumentation to avoid joining the issue of immediate and unamended ratification with their actual opponents, even though immediate and unamended ratification was the action item before the state ratification conventions, right? That's what the Conventions Act actually decided. The Federalists did not argue for that. They argued for something else. They argued for the Union. Instead, the Federalists relied upon the momentum of the ratification process to move the issue from the convention, from the hard-to-defend Bailey of immediate and unamended ratification to the easy-defend Mott of continued union. Those who would have preferred some other version of constitutional reform to meet the Union's foreign and security policy challenges were forced by the Federalist mode of argumentation and their mode of ratification to choose instead between union on 1787 Constitution terms and no union at all. Merrill Jensen, in his 1940 book, The Articles of Confederation, revived the anti-federal characterization of Federalist rhetoric. If their deliberations were not accepted, chaos would ensue. That's his characterization of the anti-federalist characterization of Federalist rhetoric. Jensen, the most influential modern anti-federalist historian, was suspicious of the Federalists, but he was not suspicious enough. The Federalists did not merely predict chaos for those who refused their new law, they promised it. There was a consensus among proponents and opponents of the 1787 Constitution that continued union was necessary to the security of the states and the American people. But the foreign policy and security failings of the Union under the Articles made constitutional reform necessary. Relying on this consensus, the Federalists exploited the threat to the Union from the reform process itself, in itself a potent argument against reform, right? Trying to change things might break the Union, not a good idea. They used this, right? They broke the Union. So potent argument against reform they used to get their reforms adopted. Thank you.
Can you talk a little bit about whether you think the example you're examining, debate over the ratification of the Constitution, is it a pretty typical example of political argumentation, or is it exceptional? In other words, the sorts of sleights of hand or the creation of a perhaps false sense of urgency, we have to do what I want, otherwise something terrible will happen. Is that commonplace in political argumentation?
Well, it's even better if you can make sure something terrible will happen.
Right.
This is an example that relates to the other talk. Some of you were present. I got a student paper last year on Israel's relationship to the IPCC, to the whole climate change issue. Now, Israel is a small country. Whatever we do in our little country is not going to make any difference at all to global climate. It's a tiny fraction of a rounding error in what happens to the world climate. 10 million people, It really makes no difference. So why should we go along? Right? Well, there are two reasons we should go along. One is, of course, that climate change is really bad, and we should do everything we can to prevent it, and we should be good citizens of the world and do our part. The other reason is that any actual regime there's likely to be a regime of enforceable sanctions against the people who don't go along. So we'd better, even if the measures proposed won't do much, even if their cost greatly outweighs their benefits, as is likely because all the measures on the table, basically, their cost greatly outweighs their benefits. We still should go along. Why? Because the benefit of going along is you don't get punished for not going along. And the advocates of the policy of going along with the international carbon control regime are going to try to make sure that you better do what they want or else. And that's independent of the scientific merits of their argument. So yeah, it's always, you want to, to understand political rhetoric, right, it's never just rhetoric. It's always about something. And you can make it more effective if you can change things in a way that makes your arguments more persuasive, right? And that's what the Federalists do, right? Everybody agrees there has to be a union. And the Federalists create a situation in which if you don't sign on to reform these particular reforms right now, you're going to be left out. You're going to be left out. And that is that's a big part of how they make it work, right? And that's a big reason for why they keep accusing their opponents of being disunionists, right? The opponents say we're not disunionists, and then they have to admit, okay, well then we better join the reform movement because otherwise we won't be in the union. So yeah, that's what you want to do, right? You want to create a situation where the things themselves persuade your audience to go along. Now, to do that, all these rhetorical devices are very helpful.
Just a moment.
What was the role of national defense in this conversation about ratifying the new Constitution? Can you talk a little bit about that?
So let me expand on that, since I had to take out a lot of the quotes. Okay, defend the country, you need an army and a navy. These things have to be paid for. Okay, the United States under the Articles had crappy credit. Pardon my French. I should say it in Dutch, really, because they were the lenders. The U.S., the French were also the lenders. That's how you could say it in French too. The merid, their credit was merid, because they hadn't paid the debts from the Revolutionary War. Okay, and they had to get what they wanted, to get decent trade terms from the British, who controlled the seas. They had to be able to threaten the British somehow, a little bit. To control the West, they had to cow the Indians. That required building and sustaining an army in the West. These things were beyond the capacity of the Confederation. The Confederation Congress could not tax. It was not a legislature. It was not a representative body. It had no power to tax under the Articles. There was a proposal to change the Articles and introduce a tax on foreign trade, the impost. But to change the Articles required the consent of all 13 states. And New York didn't want to go along with the change in the impost at first because New York was doing just fine under Confederation and it had its own impost. And then Rhode Island didn't want to go along. And so the impost failed. It failed twice. And that was a big impetus for saying, okay, this unanimous consent thing is not working. We need to change the Articles. Okay, now to change the Articles would also, presumably, under the Articles would require unanimous consent. But there was reason to think that that kind of thing could be made to work and that some sort of new tax structure could be in place that would pay for an army and a navy, the army that you needed to cow the Indians and the navy that you needed to at least threaten the British and the French a little bit and make them accept American trade on reasonable terms. Now, American trade, also, when you look at the balance of power, you have to keep in mind that the trade that the Americans were mostly concerned with was trade with the slave colonies in the Caribbean. the U.S. supplied food to these slave colonies. And there, the balance of naval power, if the U.S. could build a navy, was likely to be more favorable to the U.S. We're not talking about necessarily on the high seas or in European waters. We're talking about doing something in the Caribbean, and as Jay says, in the Mediterranean, where the piratical states had basically, they tried negotiating with the U.S., but they discovered that the U.S. could neither threaten them nor pay ransom because it couldn't tax. And so they'd given up. The U.S. it got nowhere negotiating with these states. So those are the things. Those are the present worries. That the articles, everybody agrees, the government of the articles is just not good enough because it can't raise money and it can't therefore build the army and the navy required to accomplish this whole laundry list of foreign and security, of foreign policy issues, basically security policy issues.
I was wondering, just to follow up on that, could you say a little bit more about how the framers of the Constitution or the founding generation viewed the North American Indians in relation to the security problems, but also the Constitution itself? I mean, you're familiar with John Marshall's opinions later on, where he talks about the unique status of the North American. They're not exactly a foreign country, but they're not exactly part of the United States. How did they think about that?
The Americans intended to rule the entire territory that they claimed, which meant that the Indians had to have dealings with them and with nobody else, which meant the Indians had to abandon, as Lewis explains in this speech from 1804, you're not going to be able to deal with anybody else, just with us. Okay? This also meant that realistically the United States had to protect the Indians from each other, and at least to an extent from the white settlers. But that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to rule these territories, which meant ruling the people in them, which included the Indians. Now, apart from that, right, which is all on the sort of threat side of things, what did they want or hope for from the Indians? And there, the different figures had different views of the prospects of assimilation. So Washington, for example, and the Washington administration thought that there was a good chance that it was worth trying to sort of get the Indians to go along with, to change their way of life. And they had to change their way of life very fundamentally, from a way of life based on freedom and war to one based on, agriculture and paying taxes and private property and all sorts of other things. And the hope was that this could be made to work. And the U.S. spent a lot of money and effort trying to make it work. And they also tried to protect the Indians from the settlers with some degree of efficaciousness. Now, on the Indian side, you do see some, that wasn't really your question, but it's interesting to look at the Indian side and see how the Indians responded to this. Right? In some ways, the most interesting response to me is the response of the Iroquois. The Iroquois realized after the War of Independence that they had two choices, basically. Live with the Americans under Americans' rule or leave. And most of them chose to leave, right? But went to Canada, lose the Mohawk. But the ones who stayed realized they had to make accommodations. One of the accommodations, so Handsome Lake, who had been a significant war chief, he decides that what they need is a new religion to sort of reform their existing beliefs, and something along the lines to be like the religions, this also harkens back to of their neighbors. Not necessarily, I mean, most people convert to Christianity, right? Most Iroquois today are baptized. But for the ones who didn't, there was this reformed religion, and the reformed religion included things like a separate church. It included rituals, a set apart set of rituals, abandoning the way of war. And it also included a whole vision of eschatology that fit with this, in which a unique place was reserved for George Washington, by the way. I'll tell you about that sometime. But that's what, so some of them thought that assimilation was possible. Some of them, Jefferson, thought that assimilation wasn't going to work. And if assimilation wasn't going to work, then everybody knew that the alternatives really were removal or mass murder. And the Jeffersonians giving up on assimilation went for removal. Now, but you know, the more hopeful vision was Washington's, that these people will learn to live the way we do, so that they can live with us as our neighbors under under laws essentially the same as ours. And Washington even looked toward the notion of Indian states, or an Indian state within the Union. And you know, you have to tell a whole story, in which things that happened here in Nebraska are also important. Why that never came about, right? There was you know, that remains a live policy option up until the accession of Oklahoma to the Union as a settler state. So it's interesting why that never happened, why there are no Indian states in the Union. But that was that, you know, that the Indians on some things would govern themselves the way Massachusetts or Alabama govern themselves, and on some things they would be defer to the federal union.
Other questions? Excellent. We can come back in a moment, but let's go with this gentleman. There you go.
What were some of the costs for states like Rhode Island that made them wait so long to ratify the new Constitution?
So it turns out this is, you have to get into very technical fiscal questions. But the Rhode Island had solved its debt problems by issuing paper money and made its state paper money legal tender, which meant people could pay their debts in it, not just their debts to the state of Rhode Island and Providence plantations. And it was pretty clear that this was going to be illegal. They couldn't, once they joined the union, they weren't going to be able to force people to accept Rhode Islanders to accept Rhode Island paper as payment for debts. And so basically what happened was they waited until enough debtors had paid off their debts that the former debtors were now willing to go along with the prohibition on state paper money, on state legal tender. And at that point, they submitted to the coercion. If there hadn't been the coercion, though, there's no particular, if you know, the U.S. had treated Rhode Island as part of the United States for trade purposes, they would have gone a long time, probably.
I'd like to circle back to national defense.
Mm-hmm.
We now have the Second Amendment and militias in our Constitution. There was obviously an aversion to a national standing army, but now we kind of already have one. Were there other models of national defense being proposed at the time? Like they were pretty sure Minutemen would work, and then that didn't.
Right. So, okay. So this whole standing army question is a bit confusing because, in fact, nobody is against a federal standing army because you need a federal standing army to cow the Indians. Okay. You're not going to be able to permanently rule the West with militia. You need, you know, what Wellington called the scum of the earth, enlisted for drink. Guys so desperate that they're willing to come out here and stay here. Basically, in likely cases, look at the actuarial tables or go look at the graveyards at Fort Leavenworth, really for the rest of their lives, or a good chance for the rest of their lives. And they do it because they get a little cash and they get some alcohol, and then they spend, you know, so the U.S. needed a standing army to cow the Indians. Everybody knows this. Okay, so that makes all the whole standing army debate bizarre, right? And the best the anti-federalists like Brutus can say is, well, we're not talking about that when we're talking about a federal standing army. But that is you gotta have a federal standing army. The U.S. had one under the Articles. And the Federalists point out the Articles places no limits on the size or anything else about the federal standing army. There's no Second Amendment in the Articles. So whatever your concerns are about a standing army, the only thing that will change is that now we'll have an effective standing army. And you agree we need an effective standing army because you too want to rule the West, right? You too want to rule the West. Now, the way that up until World War I, in times of emergency, the United States relied on the states mostly to muster troops and to recruit troops and muster troops, right? The Union Army was made up not entirely of state regiments, but mostly of state regiments. And you know, there was a whole complicated system of of state recruiting and federal financing. The understanding was that anything the states spent on federal purposes was going to eventually be paid back by the federal government. So the states could raise and arm troops for federal service in the knowledge that the federal government would eventually pay them back. And that was the system the US relied upon to meet emergencies up until World War I. What's interesting is, one interesting thing is, one of the lessons the Pentagon took from Vietnam was that the US moved, after World War I, moved too far away from that system. And they rebuilt the Army after Vietnam such that it cannot engage in extended operations without National Guard units. That's to say, without state military units. So there are plenty of guys who can fight in the standing army, but the guys who gas the tanks are all in the National Guard. And so if you want to fight a prolonged war, right, if Mr. Biden wants to actually fight in the Ukraine against the Russians, he's going to have to call up all these guys who fill the tanks from all these states, which means the states have to go along with it. Yeah.
You said they thought it moved too far from National Guard level. Can you, or state level, right? What does that mean? Is it like too far from the model in terms of practical and they couldn't organize it, or in terms of legal and it straight from the vision?
They fought the whole war in Vietnam all these years without much call-up of National Guard units, without any call-up of the reserves. And this meant that they could fight the war in Vietnam with less political support than would have been necessary had they had to call up National Guard units on a massive scale, had they needed to call in the reserves on a massive scale. So the Pentagon just said, no, we're not going to plan any wars like that anymore. We're going to do everything. We're going to shift vital support troops, vital support units for prolonged war. We're going to shift them into the National Guard and into the reserves. And that way, if the US wants to fight World War II all over again, or even Vietnam all over again, they're going to have to call up all these units. The president's going to have to call up all these units, which means he needs the political support to call up all these units, because we don't want to fight a prolonged war that the American people don't want to fight. So, you know, the standing army question never really goes away, but it's important to realize that there was never any alternative to it either. And the argumentation about it is a little fantastic. It's a good 18th century term, because everybody agreed there had to be a standing army.
We have time for one more question, I believe, if anybody wants to. All right. I was hoping to get another taker.
Yeah, I'd like to hear just a little bit more about, you spoke about like the political persuasion and the urgency of this timeline and how Massachusetts was this powerhouse figure. I guess if the timeline was spread out even more, would that sense of urgency in this timeline have changed the outcome at all if some of those larger states didn't jump in quite as quickly?
Right. So I think the crucial thing in Massachusetts was most people were against unamended, most of the representatives of the Massachusetts ratifying convention were against unamended ratification. And the majority flips when they're told, two things happen. One is Elbridge Gerry, who starts off as an opponent of ratification. He's one of the two delegates, he and Mason, who stuck it out through the whole convention and then refused to sign the thing. But he's asked all these questions about what happened in the convention. He's on the floor of the convention. He's brought in basically to testify at the convention. And his answers turn out to be far more favorable to the document than the opponents anticipated. That's one thing that happens in Massachusetts. But the other thing that happens is this amendments thing. Okay, the proponents of the ratification come into the convention in Massachusetts, as they did elsewhere, saying what we need is unamended ratification. And the majority in Massachusetts says, well, if that's what's on offer, then we say no. And then they make a compromise, and the compromise is, well, you'll go along with unamended ratification, but you'll state your grievances, and as soon as things get going, we're going to set out a set of amendments which will meet your fundamental grievances, and then you can decide if you want to amend the Constitution to meet these grievances. And with that, enough opponents of ratification give in and ratify. if you look at how embryonic the thing is at the time of this, you can just look at how many of the institutions of the state are around at the time the amendments are going through. It's quite clear that if the Federalists had not followed through on this, if this had just been talk and the Congress didn't actually propose amendments, you know, these states where they go, like Massachusetts, where they'd gone along with this thing because they were promised amendments, would have said, well, you know, where are amendments? You know, we're not going along with this anymore until you send us the amendments. And so, in fact, the amendments come along pretty fast in the whole history of United States state building, and they don't get amended ratification with prior amendments, but they get posterior amendments, and not all that posterior either, right? It doesn't take very long to get almost, the 12 amendments are proposed by Congress, 10 of them are ratified pretty quickly. The 12th is ratified in, the 1991, but, that's a whole, but they got the amendments that addressed their fundamental grievances, and if they hadn't gotten them, I think they would have just let the whole thing collapse, and the whole reform process would have had to start all over again.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Kochin. Thank you for attending. We will have more Constitutional Studies Forum events later in the semester, so keep an eye out for those. I'll make sure they're well advertised.